The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, The Impact of Bangladesh's Nascent Revolution on the Region. Bangladesh, one of the fulcrum points of the Indo-Pacific, and a nation born out of adversity that became one of Asia's great socio-economic success stories. But today, following violent domestic upheaval and the resignation of its long-serving leader, Bangladesh faces a crisis that has significant implications for both the country and the wider region. What will be the impact of recent events on the geopolitical landscape of South Asia and beyond? How might Bangladesh's relationships with major powers such as India and China change in the wake of Sheikh Hasina's departure? Whose influence might expand or diminish, and how will this affect regional security and strategies? To learn more about these and related issues, please tune in to our September the 18th Democracy Forum debate. Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next 90 minutes for this Democracy Forum debate, where we're going to examine the upheaval in a country that until recently had been held up as a poster child of the developing world. But before that, it was the basket case of the developing world. How far will the ripples from Sheikh Hasina's downfall resonate? Our debate, Impact of Bangladesh's Nascent Revolution on the Region. To discuss this, the Democracy Forum has brought together a superb panel: Niaz, Asadullah, Rounaq Jahan, Mustafizur, Rahman, and Tazreena, Sajjad. But before we seek their insight, I ask the President of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the canvas and background of our discussion. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. The sudden and dramatic flight of Sheikh Hasina into exile in early August has opened a new era of political and economic uncertainty for Bangladesh. Although the student-led coup, which led to her departure, was sparked by her authoritarian grip on domestic politics, it has also exposed the tangled web of relationships which her regime has forged with foreign powers, notably India, China, and the United States, inevitably which will have a consequential impact on South Asia. I'm grateful to the team at the Democracy Forum for arranging this webinar to scrutinize what has happened in Bangladesh over the last month and to consider the implications for the region. And we're particularly pleased to welcome such an erudite panel of speakers. I'd like to thank them all for agreeing to participate. And my thanks, as always, to Humphrey Hawksley for accepting the role of moderator. Allegations of foreign interference in Bangladesh politics by external actors have been widely circulating in recent months. In December last year, a Russian foreign ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, claimed that if Sheikh Hasina succeeded in winning the election on the 7th of January, the United States would attempt to overthrow her government, I quote, along the lines of the Arab Spring. And an undelivered speech purportedly written by Hasina at the time of the coup that deposed her made further allegations that the United States was seeking to destabilize her country, but these were subsequently dismissed out of hand by the White House. So if the United States has indicated a preferred political path for Bangladesh to follow, it has always stated unambiguously that this should be democratic. As Michael Kogelman, director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center, explained just over a year ago, I quote, "The United States seems to have made Bangladesh a test case for its democracy promotion policy overseas." So it's India's foreign policy that has been most shaken by the fall of Sheikh Hasina, as the political commentator Kanti Bajpai suggested recently. I quote, "India should have read the tea leaves better and should have begun to step away from such a close relationship. Indeed, there is little doubt that Sheikh Hasina became a linchpin of Narendra Modi's strategy to bolster economic ties and connectivity in response to proliferating Chinese influence. But India's support for her regime to the bitter end risks damaging it in the eyes of many Bangladeshis, suggests the Financial Times. And as the diplomat acknowledges, under the interim government of Muhammad Yunus, I quote, Bangladesh is indeed a geopolitical quagmire and has become the playground for regional and great power rivalries. There is an ongoing contest between India and China for hegemony in South Asia. If the new Bangladesh tilts one way or the other, it will fundamentally alter the balance of power. Well, I look forward with great interest to hearing our panelists' views. And if you have any comments or questions, please put them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Bruce, very much for that. The playground for regional and great power rivalries. That's what we're going to be debating. Our first speaker is Dr. Niaz Asadullah, attached to the University of Reading, North-South University, widely published with connections throughout the academic world, and his research focus has been on poverty, education, the labor market, and gender issues in South and Southeast Asian societies. What went wrong in Bangladesh? And does Southeast Asia do government better than South Asia? Niaz Asadullah, give us your thoughts.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I should start by pointing out that the recent political collapse in Bangladesh on August 5th presents a rather fascinating paradox. Unlike other countries in the region, such as Sri Lanka, this wasn't triggered by an economic meltdown. On the contrary, Bangladesh has been a global success story, consistently outperforming many other developing countries in terms of indicators of human development, as well as Millennium Development Goal achievements. And under Sheikh Hasina, Bangladesh became a model of rapid growth coupled with political stability. So for countries in South and Southeast Asia, Bangladesh's revolution occurring in a booming economy offers a broader lesson that there are what I would call social limits to economic growth in the 21st century. I would like to emphasize 21st century because in the last 2 decades, we have seen a global recession in democracy, even in many fast-growing Asian economies. At the same time, the pursuit of growth under autocracy today faces social constraint in ways that did not apply to East Asian miracle economies in the late 20th century, particularly in Southeast Asia. And I want to highlight one example, Malaysia. 6 years before Bangladesh's revolution, widespread social discontent coincided with a massive political collapse. In 2018, the 62-year-old United Malay National Organization, the very political party that gifted Malaysia an economic miracle, was voted out of power. Now, my position is that such political collapse suggests that social discontent at a time of economic prosperity is going to become more of a common paradox in years to come. And it is driven by a changing social reality. 21st century is witnessing social warming, so that broken social contracts no longer go unpunished by citizens, at least not in the long run. In countries with large young populations, the demographic dynamism creates an additional challenge. And that is that there is a growing mismatch between rising aspirations and actual achievements, particularly among the Gen Z population. And if you add to that growing social connectivity, so that adds to the frustration, laying the groundwork for latent conflicts and increasing the risk of widespread political protests. Now, I should acknowledge that many authoritarian regimes in Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam and Cambodia, have over the last 2 decades managed to sustain high levels of growth by adhering to the social contract, i.e., economic prosperity in exchange for citizens relinquishing certain political freedoms. Now, this arrangement has been successful because tangible gains in terms of job creation helped uphold the social contract, legitimizing authoritarian rule despite limitations on political participation and freedom of expression. Now, that's where Bangladesh is different. The youth movement that toppled Sheikh Hasina's regime indicates that younger generation of Bangladeshis no longer felt that the social contract was being honored. Their sense of exclusion from economic growth rather coincided with a broader dissatisfaction with the lack of political freedoms as well. And this, in a way, aligns with the observation that Gen Z in 21st century demands both positive and negative freedom. So before I finish, I should clarify why I have referred to the concept of social limits to growth. And the background is as follows. It's a bit historical in nature. 50 years ago, the Club of Rome report warned us about how finite natural resources would limit growth in the long run. Now, what we have learned from Bangladesh's spontaneous bottom-up revolution is that the constraints on growth can be also social. Widespread social frustration enabled by rising tertiary education and mass social connectivity makes it increasingly difficult to sustain political rule by suppressing citizen discontent. And that in the long run can threaten economic stability. And for that reason, if we look within Southeast Asia, in countries like Thailand that are well past their demographic window and has an aging society, we still see paradoxically a resurgence of student protest. So therefore, if I'm to kind of highlight a couple of takeaways for governments in fast-growing South and South Asian countries, one would be that regardless of regime type, governments should try to respect the social contract if growth is to be sustained in an era of social warming. And the second would be that growth alone may not be enough to maintain political stability in the absence of negative freedom. So on that note, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Niaz, Asadullah, very much for that. It's absolutely fascinating. Can I just get a clarification, if that's the right word, on one of the things, your comparison with Malaysia there, which was fascinating. Are you basically, your argument is that in Malaysia, the elections worked in that there was a change of government and have been changes, whereas in Bangladesh, the people on the streets thought that the election wouldn't work because they would always be rigged?
Absolutely. That's a very good question, because even though one party was in power for 62 years, state institutions were not destroyed. In Bangladesh, every layer of the government has been politicized to the extent that citizens could not trust anyone, police, the election commission, and so on. And that's, I think, one defining aspect that sets Southeast Asia aside when compared to Bangladesh, that the institution state capacity has been much, much better.
So in that respect, when you're talking about places like Thailand that oscillates between military and civilian rule, or Vietnam, which is a one-party state, or Cambodia, which is this dynastic, whatever you want to call it, nobody's quite. Did those organizations or those governments have a greater sense of what the people are thinking and doing? They have less hubris than, for example, in Bangladesh?
So in case of Cambodia and Vietnam, again, I would bring up the idea of social contract in the sense that if you compare labor market data for these two sets of countries, so India, Pakistan, Bangladesh in one basket, and then Cambodia, even China or Vietnam in the other basket, it's striking that youths do not experience a kind of exclusion that we see in South Asia. So there is a statistic called NEET, not in education, employment, and training. And the need figure, the average figure for Southeast Asia is way below that for South Asia. So I think it's that kind of exclusion from the growth process, regardless of whether it's an autocracy or democracy in Southeast Asia, which sets the region apart.
Yeah. That is fascinating, and I want to put to you a question from one of our audience, which you've answered, but I'm going to give it in full because you could perhaps expand on it. From Mohammed Ismail: why did Bangladesh's impressive GDP growth over the years not lead to better living standards for many Bangladeshis?
Thank you. That's a $1 million question. Some people ask whether it was growth in the first place. There has been question about manipulation of GDP data, but the other interpretation is that, well, the benefits went to the cronies. That, well, it was a booming economy, but it didn't benefit everyone. And so therefore money was spent on physical infrastructure mega projects that gave opportunities to the party activists to profit, whereas the ordinary citizens, particularly the youths, who were promised a lot of stuff, by the way, in the election manifesto, which were never delivered. So I think, it's one of those stories that we see in many other parts of the world, that the focus was on visible projects instead of human development.
So I'm trying to sum it up before we go on to our next speaker. In Bangladesh, we're talking about corruption and hubris and lack of trust. And all of those levels are there in Southeast Asia, but perhaps in a different way or to a different extent. If I'm not completely wrong about that, I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, Professor Rounaq Jahan, the Distinguished Fellow from the Center for Policy Dialogue in Bangladesh. Her career has spanned Harvard, Columbia, Chicago, and other august institutions around the world, and her expertise is on politics, gender, development, health, and one of her several latest books are entitled Political Parties in Bangladesh, Challenges of Democratization. So Bangladesh is no stranger to upheaval. Was there anything different this time? Rounaq Jahan, tell us what you know.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Democracy Forum for organizing this very timely discussion on Bangladesh, and also for inviting me to participate in it. Let me at the outset also say that it has been barely a little over a month since the student-led mass uprising toppled the 15-year-old government regime of Sheikh Hasina. So I think it is too early really to assess the proper impact of this nascent revolution, which the students call the second independence. Many people call it the monsoon revolution. I would like to talk about the impact of this student-led revolution on two fronts. First, the impact on the internal politics of Bangladesh and what could be some of the spillover effects of that on the other countries of the region. And second, I will talk about its impact on Bangladesh's external relations, particularly with her neighbors and other countries. And I'll try to address some of the questions that Lord Bruce started the conversation with. Let me first talk about the impact of this revolution on the internal politics of Bangladesh. And I think the most significant impact is that it opened up space for rebuilding democracy and good governance in Bangladesh. As many of us know, that for the last 15 years under Sheikh Hasina's rule, Bangladesh was consistently sliding backwards on all global indicators of democracy and good governance. And in fact, in recent years, Bangladesh's score on democracy indicators has been the lowest in South Asia, except for Afghanistan. So this revolution once again gives us an opportunity for reconstructing democracy. What is new about this new revolution? Bangladesh, after all, has seen many revolutions in the past. Is that I find that the students are talking about not simply about bringing back free elections. What they are talking about are structural reforms. And I think what they are emphasizing is that in future, any elected government would not be able to turn the country into an autocratic or rule the country in an autocratic manner. So what they are calling, I'm using their terms, that they do not want a fascist system to again return in Bangladesh. So what I find interesting is that, and what I think have potential of having an impact on other countries on the region, is that students have initiated a new conversation about their aspirations for a democratic politics. They want a structural changes, reforms. They are talking about more inclusive politics. They were talking about working across political divides. They are talking about breaking the cycle of winner takes all politics, and also the trend of majoritarianism. So they have a lot of aspirations. And I think the aspirations that the students are now expressing in Bangladesh, that may find resonance with the students or youth of other countries of the region. They may be thinking along that line. So this has a potential to open up a new conversation of improving the quality of democracy and governance within all the countries of South Asia, because we share many of the democracy deficits and bad governance that I think are plaguing all the countries. So if there is a conversation that Bangladesh revolution can start amongst the Gen Z in other countries of South Asia, I think that would be a good beginning. Also, I find another feature of this movement, which has the potential of influencing the youth in other countries of the region. And that is that this movement, that the students really created a lot of new slogans, very clever new slogans, new songs that they were using to break the culture of silence and then question the official narratives. And again, I think these new technologies and tools that they were using, that they managed to really mobilize all classes of people very quickly in this massive movement. So again, I think that the techniques and tools that they use to bring all kinds of people together, that can also influence people in other countries of the region if they're interested in resisting this creeping, or not creeping, really quite a full-blown authoritarianism, majoritarianism that is flourishing in all the countries of the region. Of course, all revolutions have challenges. So I think our nascent revolution also faced many challenges. Most important is for during post-revolution, there is a real fear of counter-revolution, or the revolutionaries breaking up in various groups, unleashing of vengeance. And for the new government, which is in power, I think their major challenge is the twin task of bringing stability, which is very important. Everybody is looking for stability, but at the same time initiate major reforms which will change the system. So balancing stability with change, I think this is a really very daunting task. But I'm hopeful because, from one perspective, and that is, I always find that Bangladesh has gone through many regime changes, but we have been able to maintain a steady progress in terms of economic growth and also social development. And the spirit of our ordinary people, they have a sense of justice, not committing excesses. And I think that sense of the ordinary citizens, I always have trust in that. Let me now turn to the second impact, and that is the impact on Bangladesh's relations with the neighbors, and more specifically with India. As you all know, that Sheikh Hasina built up a very good relations with India, and she had good relations with Congress-led governments and also BJP-led government. But at the same time, she was able to open up and expand good economic partnership with China. So she was balancing here both India and China, and I think she did it quite well. Her relationship with the US and Western European countries were sometimes fraught because of the fraudulent elections that she organized, and also for some of the human rights abuses that happened under her watch. In recent months, I think the very tight balancing act that Sheikh Hasina was managing, it was very difficult to manage because I think India was putting undue pressures on her, and I think that was not well received by the people within Bangladesh. So what changes now we see with the change of regime? I think what we find, of course, the biggest impact is on Bangladesh's relations with India. India has been caught on the back foot because India put all of her eggs in one basket, and and India, because Indian government supported Sheikh Hasina all through these three consecutive fraudulent elections. This did not endear India to either the other opposition parties or to the people of Bangladesh. Also, there has been a growing feeling within Bangladesh that though bilateral relations with India has improved, but that Bangladesh was not getting equal benefits from this relationship. And there had been two constant irritants. One was the issue of sharing of waters of the common rivers, and the other was the killing of Bangladeshi civilians by Indian border security forces. The interim government that is now in Bangladesh is signaling a few changes in policy towards India and the world. I think first, the interim government signals is that it wants to have good relations with India, but the emphasis is on that this relationship would have to be on more equal terms, and that Bangladesh will scrutinize more carefully what benefits Bangladesh is getting out of this improved bilateral relationship. Second, I think Bangladesh, the new regime is giving signals that Bangladesh would like to see some of the regional associations like SAARC to be revived, and Bangladesh has also given the signal that it wants to join other associations such as ASEAN. And then, of course, Bangladesh wants to have stronger relations with US, but that relation should be more directly between Bangladesh and US and not have to go through Indian mediation. And of course, I think the future of Indo-Bangladesh relations, I think, depends very much now on India. The ball is on India's court because Bangladesh, the new government in Bangladesh has expressed an interest that it wants to maintain good relations with India. And I believe that the relations with China, because it is primarily on economic relationship, that will stay and also will expand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rounaq Jahan. That was fascinating. Could I just take you back to the origins again? Because you talked about the political reform and the structural reform that was needed, and that has been reformed in the past when Ershad was overthrown in the early 90s and so on and so forth. Just tell us or remind us, what were the forces in Bangladesh at the time of Sheikh Hasina's overthrow? There was her party, there was another party, there was the Islamist forces. Just put all that in perspective for us.
Now, of course, Sheikh Hasina, because of these 3 consecutive elections, which of course have not been have been completely managed by her, the opposition never had a chance. So her party was dominant, but just because they were in power, that does not mean that the opposition, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, they were also present. They were not in state power, but they had popular support. Then, of course, we had a variety of Islamist parties such as Jamaat-e-Islam, and some of the other Islamist parties. And when we had free elections, for instance, from between 1990 to 2006, when power rotated between the 2 major parties, we always saw that the Islamists never have more than 8 to 10% of electoral votes, and they could never get to power on their own. But they, because of that tight race between the Awami League and BNP, the Islamists, even though they had 10%, they can swing to one side or another, and then they, as an alliance partner, they can come.
In those main 2 parties, the Awami League and the Bangladesh National Party, were they simply rival dynasties, or did they have ideological affiliations, particularly to countries outside Bangladesh?
So generally, I think the main set of ideological differences is that the Awami League, at least in their manifesto, they said that it is a secular party, and the Bangladesh Nationalist Party and some of the other parties, then they did not have secularism as one of the goals. And they would, say, some would say in a more explicit way that they would be Islamist, and others would just give some sort of symbolic nod to Islam. But generally, I mean, nobody apart from Bangladesh, of the major parties, Awami League objective is explicitly they said they are secular. This is the ideological formal position. But in effect, I think that there really was not, in terms of economic policies or social policies, between the 2 mainstream parties, there was not that much of a major policy differences, but the narratives, historical narratives of their role in various phases of our history, every party wanted to create their own narrative, which created a lot of problems. Okay. What I found that with this new one of the demands, but we do not know exactly where this is leading, the students who now led this movement, they are saying that we want to get out of this divide and binary politics of Awami League versus the BNP, and all these narratives and counter narratives, acquisitions, counter acquisitions, and so we want
I think you've made some very good points there. That's the reform of the political system, and also getting out of this narrative and counter narrative 2-party system, which is more familiar to the Western system there. And the US, of course, had described Bangladesh as a sort of test of successful democracy in South Asia and the wider region, and that and that thesis has been thrown out. Let's think as we go through this of how those new structures would work that we've just heard about. But now we're going to our third speaker, Mustafizur Rahman, Professor Mustafizur Rahman, a colleague of our previous speaker and a distinguished fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue, a former professor at the University of Dhaka, and in our increasingly multipolar and polarizing world, he studied at Kharkov State University in Ukraine and at Moscow State University and then at Oxford University and Singapore. So if anybody knows the multipolar strains and influences, it is him. And part of his research focus has been on trade and the economy. The student protests coined this phrase, second freedom or second independence. What did they mean and what could be the consequences? Mustafizur Rahman, reveal all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Hawksley. And I'm very grateful to the Democracy Forum for this opportunity. And I agree with what my fellow panelists have also mentioned. Yes, the Monsoon Revolution is being termed as the second independence, second freedom. And it started in July and ended on 5th of August. So they are also calling it 36th of July. So, as far as I understand, when they talk about the second independence, I think it is also related to the first independence, but it is also a second independence, meaning that there is a continuation and also there is a rupture. Continuation in the sense that when the students were coming out on the streets and sacrificing their lives, they had the Bangladesh flag on their head and in their hands. So that's the 1971 Bangladesh's independence. But at the same time, they are also talking about a new Bangladesh. And they were also talking about a rupture with what they have been experiencing. And that rupture has a number of dimensions. Of course, the political dimension, which Professor Rounaq Jahan has so brilliantly gave an exposition to, I think that is understood. They didn't want to live under an autocratic regime. Most of these students who were between maybe 15, 25 years of age, they haven't ever seen a fair election. They have seen only the autocracy, the freedom of speech, the various restrictions, the Cybersecurity Act, which compelled them to exercise self-censorship because the state power was always monitoring what is being discussed. So that was one freedom that they wanted. The freedom from an autocracy, the freedom from subjugation, cyber monitoring. So that's one dimension. But the second one, which was also very important because it started with the quota reformation. Because as Niaz was mentioning, the higher the education, the higher is the unemployment rate. Amongst 15 to 29, not in education, employment, or training, the NEET population was almost 40% of the total population. They were also experiencing that the income inequality, the wealth inequality, consumption inequality, and over the last 2 years particularly, we had double-digit inflation, which also curtailed the purchasing power of their parents. So whilst we talk about student-led revolution, we also have to take into account that it was also the masses which came together during the last few days, and it became a student mass revolution. So when the students talks about the second independence, they also talk about the economic issues which the general masses were aspiring for. So that is also another issue. The third one, I think, is also the political and regional dimensions which the students were thinking about. Professor Rounaq Jahan mentioned about, for example, India giving support to the fraudulent elections, and that also had an element of, I would say, against India particularly, that they thought that the Indian powers that be were keeping the previous government of Sheikh Hasina in power. So that is also something they wanted to also get freedom from. The other is, of course, the state reformation. So that is also something which they are now talking about the various reforms, starting with the way that financial sector, the way that the taxation system, the way the distributive justice issues are also coming about. And I think that because as we go forward, we are also witnessing that it's not a monolithic entity. There will be various perceptions and perspectives also. Some are wanting to rewrite the constitution, some are wanting to amend the constitution of 1972, some are wanting to have a constituent assembly which would come up with a new constitution. So there are also various perspectives amongst the students and also amongst the broader society as well, because as I was mentioning, that the masses came in large numbers, and if you look at the 850 plus deaths, the overwhelming majority of these were also common people. So state reformation is also something which has come out in the course of the second revolution, and I think that also will have to be resolved as we go forward. As Professor Rounaq Jahan said, that things are still not stable. It will take some time to take shape, and how the new interim government will address these various perspectives is also something that we'll look at. The other point that I would also like to mention, and I mentioned it, that the regional perspectives. I think that there is that dimension as well, how Bangladesh would situate itself in the region, the relationship with India, for example. I think that one perspective is that we will have to be equal in our relationship with our neighbors. It should not be at least perceived to be seen as one of big brother and one of over dependence. But I think that as we go forward, these also will stabilize as the reality comes in. For example, India is our second largest trading partner. The prices in Bangladesh depends on many of the prices from imports from India. So we are dependent on India, and as a major export destination, India is also dependent on Bangladesh. So I think that the elements of the second independence, exactly what there will be, we will have to see. I think that there will be some reality check also as we go forward. But the state reformation within Bangladesh, that will become a major issue. We have seen during the last regime how the banks were looted, how billions of dollars, on average $7-8 billion, were taken out of the country through illicit financial outflows. Bangladesh has the world's lowest revenue GDP ratio. So all these now are part of the state reconstruction, as they are telling. So there are a number of attempts now to setting up various commissions and addressing those. So I think that is also another part of the element of the second independence, which, as I was mentioning, is also an elements of rupture. So more inclusive society, more accommodating society, democracy. These are aspirations which has emerged both as a push factor from the erstwhile regime, but also as pull factors through the changes that has emerged through the Mansour Revolution.
That is very good. You have a huge shopping list there of things that need to be done, which in other countries, including Bangladesh, take decades or generations to do. Is it possible? Does the structures really need amending, or just should there just not be a mechanism that can be put in to stop a winning party taking absolute control? Would that be an easier way forward, or do you have to have constitutions and assemblies and rewriting constitutions and that sort of thing?
I think, yeah, that's a very pertinent, I think, query, and we are also grappling with it. How do we do that? We need, for example, electoral democracy. Now, whether
but you had that after. I mean, you had it when Bangladesh was created. You had it after Ershad's overthrow and after the Cold War and everything. And we've seen around the world that these things aren't just created around a committee table. Also, John Elliott has asked a question here that you could answer. It would be interesting to know where the student demands originated, how triggered it all, and how was it that Muhammad Yunus suddenly appeared and was accepted? How planned was this whole thing, and what was the influence behind it?
It was triggered by the quota movement of the students, and when 30% of the jobs were kept for the children and grandchildren of the freedom fighters.
That was the catalyst, but was the catalyst. Yeah. But what was the organization behind it? Because it was incredibly effective, wasn't it?
Yeah. That's a million-dollar questions. I think it will take for us some time to understand what organizational, core has triggered it. The students demonstrated a lot of organizational capacity. Some of them were familiar with even the political process. Some had participated in the student elections in the universities. So that's the core, the 6 coordinators who led it. But they really demonstrated enormous organizational capacities, not only in the public university, but also in the private universities. And then the people also joined.
Have you witnessed a similar organizational capacity in moving forward to the next stage to implement the second freedom, or are you seeing arguments and disagreements?
Till now, they are trying to project a unified stand. But I think when the nitty-gritties will come, there will be different perspectives, because then the concrete steps that will be taken, we'll have to see. But the question that you have put, very right, sustainability of the changes, and we had witnessed in 1990 after the decade-long regime of military rule, we also had this type of situation. So this time around, there will be obviously, because Professor Yunus is highly respected, they will try to do reforms. And one major issue which the Awami League government, it was there, the caretaker government which oversees elections, that through constitutional amendment was done with. So that was one period, for example, in Bangladesh from 1990 to 2005, that was the period when we had 4 elections, more or less fair elections. So if that is put in place, then I think that there will be some modicum, of course, it will not be perfect perhaps, but some modicum of democratic transition.
Okay,
and that is what they are trying to do.
Thank you very much. There's this whole question on the validity of elections and the effectiveness on them when you're in a developing nation, which we can get to after our final speaker. And John Elliott has come back with another thing that I think all the panel can think about. We're going to talk about Pakistan and Sri Lanka and India after our final speaker in more detail. And John Elliott says that no one expected this to lead to the downfall of Sheikh Hasina. Was there any outside force encouraging a change of regime and the choice of Muhammad Yunus? Don't answer that now. Let's all think about that, because we're going to our final speaker, Dr. Tazreena Sajjad, a School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C. Her expertise is in the areas of peace, human rights, cultural relations, refugees, conflict and post-conflict justice, gender, and it's an issue she's written very widely on, from Myanmar to Ukraine, much in between, so that widespread canvas that she has. This last presentation is going to focus also on the women of the protest movement. How significant are they, and how does their involvement relate to what's happening now in the wider region? Tazreena Sajjad, explain this tapestry to us.
Thank you, first of all, to the Democracy Forum for inviting me, and thank you to all the panelists who have spoken so brilliantly and provided such a wonderful insight into what transpired in Bangladesh in 2024. I want to sort of start my conversation and sort of challenge the notion of the word revolution a little bit. Certainly and undoubtedly, students and those inside Bangladesh have called it a revolution, especially in the early days. It has been embraced by many in terms of seeing it as a monsoon revolution, as a July revolution. But here there are certain things, there's something interesting to sort of reflect on, is that, as the interim administration emerged, the language of revolution has been transformed into the language of reform. And that's really important, because the language sets the parameters of possibility. And so rather than thinking about this in terms of a enormous structural change, a societal change, what we have really now focused on through the lenses of the interim administration, and what is really being talked about, are the specific types of reform Bangladesh needs. And this is also present in terms of a new research report that just came out, as well as, of course, the conversations that the interim administration is having within itself and with the people of Bangladesh. And they are really about economic reform. Professor Mustafizur Rahman already talked about it. There is the conversation about electoral reform that is also part of the very important nature of the transition to democracy and a sustainable democracy. There is also questions of judicial reform, and that is something that is extremely important to make sure that the conversations and the demands outside of the quota reform, it's important to sort of emphasize the fact that this mobilization was very much focused on anti-discrimination, and that anti-discrimination element is present throughout Bangladesh in terms of the ways structural barriers exist for different Bangladeshis, whether they're indigenous, whether they're related to questions of women and the queer community, as well as, of course, other marginalized populations. And so the question of judicial reform has to be one of the biggest sort of challenges that the interim administration has to take into consideration. Now, being the last person on the panel means that some of the things that I might say might sound repetitive, but I want to sort of point out three things in terms of who is the audience for the political developments that took place in Bangladesh in the form of an uprising in July, and that is still unfolding right now. And a lot of the focus has been on the major powers. The United States, of course, a long investor in Bangladesh's economic infrastructure, a long history, actually, and a contentious history, I would say, with regard to 1971 and Bangladesh's birth, but also in terms of its at least rhetorical commitment to questions of political freedom. But there's also the Indo Indo-Pacific strategy, where Bangladesh does play a role implicitly, explicitly, directly, and indirectly, which is why the United States is very interested in seeing what transpires in Bangladesh. Second is, of course, China, and I believe some of the panelists have really sort of addressed that significantly. And then there's been extensive conversation around India as well, in terms of India's interests, economic, India's interests, political, and India's interests regarding mainstream security concerns, which is why there has been so much support for the Hasina regime, and of course, so much of uproar inside of India in terms of what is going to happen in Bangladesh next. But I want to really focus on two other tiers, broadly speaking, in terms of an audience that we haven't sort of addressed. First is, of course, the young population. And Professor Jahan touched on it a little bit, and I want to broaden it a little more to sort of say, you know, the youth population in South Asia and in other parts of the so-called developing world is significant. They're significant in terms of number, they're significant in terms of demands, and they're significant in terms of how they are relating to the 21st century. And here, a lot of the times, the measures that are taken to address the demands with regard and understanding of the youth is very limited, and sometimes I would say highly patronizing. And so the question of the youth tied to questions of unemployment is significant, but at the same time, it doesn't take into account how they engage with questions of justice, how they have accumulated and understand the history of their countries and context, the history of deprivation and history of opportunities, as well as, of course, sort of trying to understand how they engage with questions of political freedom. And so digital freedom and freedom of speech was a very important role in the context of mobilizing students in Bangladesh. There is also the question in terms of their digital literacy. And so when we talk about the second layer of audience, the resonance in terms of what happened in Bangladesh with regard to the student-led mobilization was observed by, for instance, young people in Pakistan. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, youth mobilizations in Pakistan are very similar to the ones in Bangladesh. Neither am I saying that things that happened even in the context of 2024 was inspired by Bangladesh. But if you follow the news in terms of, for instance, what has been happening in Balochistan and the uprising with regard to the ongoing struggles of the Balochi people, then you have to sort of pay attention to how young people within that movement had been paying attention to what is possible within the context and within their struggles in a different part of South Asia. West Bengal is also really interesting to sort of observe in that regard. They have had the Nabonno Abhijan for several years now, and that was also been about questions of corruption, poor governance, and particularly about women's rights as well. And so there has been a synergy in terms of recognizing the role of social media in terms of communicating ideas, strategies, possibilities, demands, and how mobilization has taken place. So there is resonance here in terms of thinking about the second layer of an audience that we don't talk about, particularly when we talk about great powers or geopolitics with a capital G. There is also the audience with regard to the Bangladesh in Europe, but it also spans other places, including, of course, the Gulf countries, where you have large numbers of labor migrants who have keenly followed what has happened in July and who are invested in what happens in Bangladesh economically, politically, socially. And of course, the third layer, which is inside of Bangladesh, which also has resonance as a result of how Bangladesh is connected to both the global political economy, but also in terms of social, political, and cultural relations with the rest of the world. And there, the question about women's roles become really important. Now, women's mobilizations in Bangladesh have a very long history. Professor Jahan can speak to this much more eloquently than I and much more in depth. And these mobilizations have been in the past, even been prior to the birth of, during, for instance, the British rule, certainly during the struggle for independent Bangladesh in the 1970s, and even during, for instance, the 1969 student movement, and certainly during the mobilization with regard to the fall of the Ershad regime. But women's mobilizations have also been of different kinds. We have always had, for instance, garment workers who have been highly mobilized in Bangladesh, with regard to very specific issues of their demand. We've had women in the streets for enormous periods of time at different moments in Bangladesh's contemporary history, particularly when it comes to questions of women's safety in public spaces. And so one of the very stark realities in terms of observing the student mobilization that translated into a mass mobilization. And what is interesting is, of course, to keep in mind that a student mobilization doesn't always automatically have salience in the broader population. This time in July, it did, for reasons that we have talked about, and I'm sure we will talk about later on. And so looking at the role of young women, queer women, working women, and then, of course, indigenous women in the context of and minoritized women in the student mobilization, it has been a pretty striking sort of portrayal of how questions of justice and freedom in their enormous imaginings have played a role in bringing this question of Bangladesh's democracy to the forefront. And yet, in the transitional period, even in the interim administration, it depends on perspective. When you see the composition of the interim administration, some would say, well, it is a clear win. We have had at least 4 eminent women in the interim administration. But the other question remains is that the most that the women in Bangladesh who have struggled and have been in the forefront of so many political mobilizations in the past, and certainly in July 2024, is this the most that they could actually win? And then secondly, in terms of looking at the 6 commissions that have come into play, they're all headed by men. And so there's a broader conversation to be had here in terms of political transitions and post-conflict transitions, and the role of young people, the role of marginalized communities, and the role of women in these more powerful structures that can lead to reform. And that's something to reflect on in terms of their structural invisibility in some way, shape, or form, and how that is not necessarily being thought of as a critical component of our conversation in terms of the contributions of women and young people and marginalized people at the height of the revolution. And yet, when we look at the question of reforms that have emerged, it's still being part of the conversation around elite bureaucrats. And so the question that has resonance outside of Bangladesh, both in terms of scholarship and in terms of practice and policy, is to what extent do post-conflict transitions really allow for these voices to come to the forefront, to broaden as well as deepen our understanding of what, even in the limited state-centric view, what reform should look like, who should be integrated into those in the analysis and in terms of quote-unquote solutions, and who are going to constantly be left out once that period of normalization begins. And that normalization is also part of the legitimization process. So I'm going to end here and open the floor for any questions, but I think there's a lot to unpack here in terms of the resonance with regard to youth mobilization, marginalized mobilization, as well as women's mobilization in July 2024 in Bangladesh, and how it has salience for women and other youth populations and marginalized populations, both in South Asia and elsewhere outside of South Asia.
Thank you, Tazreena, Sajjad. That's magnificently pulling the argument forward. I think I want to ask you a couple of elements. One on the digital freedom thing you said, because John Elliott came in here saying, no one expected this to lead to the downfall of Sheikh Hasina. Was there any outside force in encouraging the change of regime? Is it your view that it was the digital freedom, as in the Arab Spring sort of digital freedom, that did it, or that there was a force there that was sort of guiding it along?
Right. So, as a professor, I always tell my students there's a difference between causation and correlation, and there is no singular variable you could sort of trace and say, aha, this is the reason why the magic happened, when it did not result in a significant outcome in the past. I think there are lots of things to think about, and the outside forces, I'll put that in quotation marks because it automatically it implies the role of the foreign hand, right? In terms of other state interests, right? Were other state forces involved, and there was a lot of conversation actually inside Bangladesh and outside of Bangladesh as well in terms of why is it happening suddenly. If you were to do the process tracing though of what led to July 2024, one thing we didn't get a chance to talk about is, even if we limited our conversation to the quota reform movement, that didn't begin in 2024. It had significance in terms of 2018, and then there was the Supreme Court and the High Court of Bangladesh that was also connected to that. And then, of course, to sort of think about, how the student mobilization, which really translated to broader frustrations of the public. And this is where, a lot of the times we had student mobilizations in Bangladesh and it didn't translate into broader grievances of the public. And this time it did. And it's really important to ask why. Well, the killing of the students definitely played a significant role, because after all, many of the people who came out initially to support the students were the parents, teachers, and the professors, right? Along with, of course, judges and lawyers. And I think that's a really important relational sort of aspect we need to sort of.
So in your view, this was an indigenous people power movement, right, as opposed to some outside foreign hand, as you
right. So let me unpack that. I mean, I wouldn't use the word indigenous because obviously indigeneity means something very specific, right? But I think in the context of Bangladesh, to dismiss the fact that there was so much significant grievance that had been building up over the years. The fact that this was provided an opportunity for people who are sympathetic to the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, to the Jamaat-e-Islami, to take advantage of the student mobilization. And of course, you mentioned digital literacy. I don't want to overplay the hand of digital literacy, but Professor Rahman mentioned the question of the issue of cybersecurity, and I believe Professor
Can I just on the digital thing, I just want to ask you one more question. This is the Gen Z, the younger people that you're talking about, who are digitally connected around the world. And there's much more, if this is not the right word, pick me up on it, there's much more gender fluidity there. The young people in their teens and 20s are not so sort of gender specific as older generations. Would that have an impact on South Asia's culture and the way of thinking politically?
That's a huge question, and I would not be able to answer it.
You can say yes or no.
No, what I would say is, the Cybersecurity Act and the Digital Security Act were mentioned, and that really impacted the young population. And I think it's really important to emphasize that, because how satire was banned, how Facebook was monitored and surveyed, how memes became a problem, how criticisms of, Sheikh Hasina was seen to be, was sort of an issue of a crime, where students could not express their political opinion on their social media feeds. That obviously played a significant role. Right. And I think that in that context, you have to sort of recognize that men, women, and other genders were extremely frustrated by the very narrowed political space they were being allowed, outside of not being allowed to vote in a free and free.
Okay, but the gender element there, is that becoming less polarized, as it were, because of the digital world?
Well, I mean, what I would say is that, social media allows for more equitable distribution of information and access. Having said that, social media is also used in very specific gendered ways for harassment purposes as well. So it's much more sort of relationship, right? But I think the frustration that was felt was not just by the young men of Bangladesh. It was also felt by the young women in Bangladesh in terms of questions of, their ability to express themselves and communicate with each other, as well as mobilize.
Thank you very much for that. We're now going to open up to the panel on a series of questions, which I'm going to read all the questions from the audience out and then go back to the way we came around. That they are about the impact on the region. So Philip Bowman asks, what adverse effects might Sheikh Hasina being in India have on Delhi's relationship with the interim government in Dhaka? Ritesh Nigam says, could what has happened in Bangladesh be repeated in Pakistan, which faces many of the same problems? And Nadeem Shah says, how far can we compare the situation in Bangladesh with the one in Sri Lanka? So I'm going to ask all the panelists to think about that and give us a short summary of your thoughts. Niaz Asadullah.
Thank you. So as I've clarified in my commentary that South Asian countries do have one thing in common, which is this huge demographic pool of frustrated achievers. And that's been true for Pakistan as well as for Bangladesh, if you go by the neat statistic. So therefore, there is a pressure cooker that politicians have to be wary about. And if not addressed, that can snowball into a larger political problem. So Sri Lanka, on the other hand, is different. Although they had student involvement, but that happened in a context of extremely high inflation, an economy which was on the brink of collapse. So students just accelerated the political process, and so that's quite different. So, but Pakistan, for that reason, does have another thing in common with Sri Lanka in the sense that the economies are on a much shakier ground compared to Bangladesh. So Pakistan, for that reason, has a lot more in common with Sri Lanka. So therefore, these are definite risk factors that governments in this part of the world have to look into.
It's because in Sri Lanka, of course, the similar protests threw out the president a couple of years ago.
That's correct.
Rounaq Jahan, do you agree with that? Could you give us your thoughts on these close neighbors?
Yes, I mean, there are two questions. One is comparison with Sri Lanka, another is with Pakistan. Going to Sri Lanka, as just mentioned earlier by Niaz Asadullah, it was primarily economic issues that mobilized. In Bangladesh, started with the students' quota system, which was more about discrimination, and they were talking about merits, and then very focused on democratic rights and malgovernance, bad governance issues. Students' slogan was on justice, not bringing back dynastic rule. And they are all the time focusing on not going back to the same kind of politics. The Bangladeshi students are very aware of what happened in Sri Lanka, where very quickly then it went back a counter-revolutionary moment. And so I think what in Bangladesh, what students are trying to do is not to go back to a situation where there would be a counter-revolution or the old style politics would come back. So it is very much focused right now in Bangladesh on what they are focusing on all the time by saying a democratically elected leader can turn into a fascist. And so how can you sort of
how can you? So there are
situation in Bangladesh, because we don't have so many social. I mean, we have rich and poor, but not so many linguistic differences in a major or ethnic. So in Bangladesh, mobilizing people actually, and the successful mobilization cases in Bangladesh has much more of that. See, if you look at Bangladesh, almost every 10 years, I mean, there had been autocrats or despots, but every 10 years, they are more or less toppled by a mass mobilization led by students. This happened in 1990. This happened, say, with Ayub Khan in 1969. Ayub came to power in 58, 69. So then we are, and Sheikh Hasina came through an election in 2008. She didn't face the election in 2014. And lo and behold, by 2024, she has gone. So in Bangladesh, in some way, it is the same language, so that it is much, socially, it is much easier to mobilize. A very successful mobilization, mobilization to overthrow government. Bangladesh has many examples of that, which is much more difficult in Pakistan, also because uh, they have some strong state institutions, including the military, which always have a veto power. So it's not the same. India also, I think, will not, the youth may be inspired, but it is very difficult to have the same kind of successful mobilization of toppling governments as we have in Bangladesh.
And Mustafizur, Rahman, you laid out for us the length and the various details that needed to be done to put in place a stable government, on paper at least. Do you agree with Rounaq Jahan that the Bangladesh way of doing it is slightly different to the others, or is it the case that in Pakistan, in the last elections and those things, that in Sri Lanka and in various other places, that this people digitally inspired youth protests do have things in common?
Thank you. I think I tend to agree with Professor Rounaq Jahan, but having done that, I also think that that there are some common things which I think in future at least will inspire other movements in the subcontinent and also around the region. One is the power of the youth. I think that has been demonstrated, and that can have an influence on other countries. Obviously, every country will have its own distinctive features, but I think that the power of social media, the way that young people can mobilize around the social media, the power of using a particular popular point and then mobilizing others also around it, and bringing other types of grievances also towards it, gravitating it towards that particular issue. I think that is something which people will take note of. But as I said, it comes in various shapes, and the reasons may be very different. But
it's still there, isn't it? I just want to go back to Niaz Asadullah briefly here. Is it the case that India is the only country in South Asia where people actually trust elections?
So this is one thing that, yes, can you hear me? So this is one thing that does, make India stand out in the sense that the quality of institutions. So even during the current regime of Narendra Modi, there is so much anxiety over democratic backsliding, but I think there is broad agreement that, the electoral institutions were left untouched in ways that wasn't true for Bangladesh. And I think that does offer India with an advantage and hope of democratic renewal, if you like.
Oh, I mean, India has had a recent election whereby Narendra Modi had his wings clipped by the electorate, as it were, whereas in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Pakistan, there seems to be a sense that whatever you vote, that's not going to have much of an impact. Tazreena, Sajjad, is that a reasonable assumption?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that the histories of these countries, at least in South Asia, are connected, but they're also extremely divergent. And I think, India has existed for a much longer time than, for instance, Bangladesh. It also is much bigger, and its political governance structure is very different from Bangladesh. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Northern India, of course, is very different from southern India, and then you have questions with regard to West Bengal, and that diversity truly matters in terms of electoral cycles, in terms of constituents, in terms of the issues they care about, and how people vote, right? In Bangladesh, it's a much smaller country, it's a newer country, and it has a very different kind of centralized command and control when it comes to questions of political governance. So those distinctions matter. I do want to sort of go back to the one question with regard to Pakistan that was raised earlier, and I think it's important to outline that there are parallels between Bangladesh and Pakistan, particularly in terms of the relationship of the military to the democratic or governance structure, as well as some of the challenges in terms of corruption and so on and so forth. But the diversity of issues in Pakistan is very, very different in terms of ethnic tensions, in terms of demands for autonomy, and in terms of the relationship of ethnic minorities and tribal minorities or minoritized populations with the military. And so, what you're seeing in terms of Balochistan is going to be very different in the context of, for instance, Sindh. And so those differences are going to really matter in terms of if there is large scale student mobilization. And by the way, this will happen in the context of other people's movements that have been going on in Pakistan as well. It will have to have a different type of infrastructure as well as a demand setting, right? It may not necessarily involve the same set of demands or in the same set of priorities or in the same hierarchy of priorities, because you are talking about very different types of questions in terms of both governance and the identity of Pakistan as well.
Okay, that is an interesting perspective there. I want to go around again in our final question to take us back to the title of this debate, the impact of Bangladesh's nascent revolution on the region. Could I go around the panel as we started and just sum up what you think the impact is? We've touched on many things here, and I would like you to encapsulate your thoughts. Niaz, Asadullah.
Thank you. So I think this is a window of opportunity for the entire region where we have seen democratic backsliding. There is a lot of optimism that there could be this diffusion of spirit of Bangla Revolution in the wider region. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that countries within the region differ in terms of their legacy of how the population has been governed. Within Southeast Asia, there is a longer legacy of developmental state. And therefore, with a track record, a long track record to honor social contract, of course, we don't expect any imminent surprise of the kind we have seen in Bangladesh. But I think the chances are bigger for us to witness something similar in South Asia. So I think that's one very distinct point. Having said that, this is also a very connected world. With globalization, ideas are spreading very fast, and therefore I think which may also have a kind of positive impact on the developmental growth-minded states in the Southeast Asia, in the sense that they may slowly also open up to ideas of granting their citizens some sort of in some sort of negative freedom, so which has been short in supply. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just wondering, as you were speaking there, is Sheikh Hasina's downfall a warning card to the others, or would they be prompted to clamp down even harder than she did? Rounaq Jahan, impact of Bangladesh's nascent revolution on the region. Sum up your thoughts.
My thoughts are that, as I mentioned, that there is a lot of potential avenues of impact that I find, that the messages of the students, the strategies and techniques that they really use, these young people fantastically to mobilize. These things have potentials for learning in other countries of the region. But for that, I think what is very much needed is for the academics, particularly media, to really take an interest in what is going on in other countries of the region. And when I read some of the, particularly in the media, what gets published, say for instance in India about what happened in Bangladesh, then there is not really that much. There is always what we started with, has it been sort of conspired in some other countries? Has it been imposed from outside? But not look at whether there is a conspiracy or not, let another author or somebody come up with evidence. But what has been actually happening in Bangladesh? What is there to learn? And particularly for this bulging youth population, not only in Bangladesh, all countries of South Asia, one problem that Tazreena said, that revolutions or uprisings are done by students, but when it settles down, then it is again the all elderly people, and then they are supposed to bring the fruits. And then the youth always gets, or the young women always feel left out. So I think if some of these kinds of issues can be written up, and other countries of the region really take a serious interest, particularly the
study,
media, serious interest in what is happening to the people, I think that would be what I would like to see happen moving forward.
Use it as a sort of litmus test, as it were. Mustafizur, Rahman, the impact of Bangladesh's nascent revolution on the region, and also could you answer Philip Bowman's question very quickly, is will Sheikh Hasina being India have an adverse effect on the interim government in Dhaka?
Thank you. What I think is that, you see, now it's the interim government and we will have a transition. Today or after 2 years, there will be a democratic transition. And then the government which will come, it will have to deal with the reality on the ground. So now, obviously, we have a lot of sentiment on various issues. But I think that economic rationale will also reset the relationship, which has, of course, undergone, particularly with respect to India, a lot of changes. So okay. I think so I think that the relationship that Bangladesh had with India, China, Russia, USA, the balancing act that was Sheikh Hasina was doing, I think there will be a reset of that, but there will be another balance. And Sheikh Hasina being in India, obviously it is a very sensitive issue, and when the cases will be lodged in the court, then obviously there will be question of her facing it in Bangladesh. That will be a challenge.
Thank you very much. Tazreena, Sajjad, you have about 10 seconds to give us your final view.
Right. So post-conflict transitions are moments of euphoria, and they're also extremely dangerous periods. And so what does that period mean in 2024 in South Asia and in terms of great powers watching? I've talked about US, India, China. Other panelists have addressed that. But there's also the question of Myanmar as well in terms of relationship building and negotiations. Beyond that, it's important to ask, how are economic reforms being imagined, and is it going to be the same kind of neoliberal sort of restructuring of the country, or consolidation of the processes that will produce the same kind of sense of marginalization amongst those who really came out to the streets for a vision? So for the rest of the region watching, these are really important questions to sort of answer. What does economic reform really mean? What does political reform mean in the context of the youth population and in the context of how they connect with each other beyond the political boundaries of their specific nation states?
Excellent. Those are the questions for the whole region to ask and to take notice of the youth and the digital revolution. Thank you, everybody. What a fantastically insightful debate. I have learned a lot. I hope you all have as well. Thank you, Niaz, Asadullah, Rounaq Jahan, Mustafizur, Rahman, Tazreena, Sajjad. Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, for setting the scene, and for all at the Democracy Forum for making this debate happen. Our next debate is Pakistan Dilemma, the military v democracy, continuing the theme in South Asia of how reform is going to happen. Tune into that next month. The date will be up on our website. And until then, from all of us at the Democracy Forum, thank you for being here, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Telling you, yeah.